July 22nd, 1991, 11:30 p.m. Tracy Edwards ran barefoot down North 25th Street in Milwaukee, wearing only a pair of jeans, one handcuff dangling from his left wrist. He flagged down Milwaukee police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, gasping that a man had tried to kill him, that there were photographs of dead people in an apartment, that he'd barely escaped. The officers looked at the terrified 32-year-old man, noted the handcuff, smelled the chemical odor clinging to his skin. Edwards led them back to the Oxford Apartments, a low-rent building at 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213. Jeffrey Dahmer answered the door calmly. He was 31 years old, white, wearing glasses, polite in his demeanor. He apologized for the misunderstanding, explained that he and Edwards had been drinking, that things had gotten out of hand during a disagreement. He offered to get the handcuff key from his bedroom. Officer Mueller accompanied him. In the bedroom, Mueller noticed photographs scattered on a nightstand. He picked one up. It showed a human torso, split open, internal organs visible. Another showed a man's head, severed, lying on a table. Mueller drew his weapon. "Freeze! Put your hands up!" Dahmer lunged for Mueller, trying to resist. The officers subdued him, forced him to the floor, cuffed him. While Routh held Dahmer down, Mueller moved deeper into the apartment, following a smell that had been present since they entered, a thick, sweet rot that caught in the throat. He opened the refrigerator. On the bottom shelf, on a plate, sat a freshly severed human head, the neck cleanly cut, the eyes half open, the skin still holding color. Mueller backed away, his training barely containing his revulsion. He opened the freezer compartment. 3 more human heads, frozen solid, stacked like groceries. By midnight, the apartment was swarming with police and forensic investigators. What they found over the next 8 hours would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. A 57-gallon drum in the bedroom contained 3 torsos in various stages of decomposition, dissolved in acid. The closet held 2 complete skeletons, cleaned and bleached. In boxes throughout the apartment, 7 skulls, some painted gray, some bleached white. 4 severed heads in the freezer. A human heart in a box in the freezer, wrapped in plastic. 2 severed penises in a pot on the stove. Photographs, hundreds of photographs, documenting the entire process of murder, dismemberment, and preservation. Polaroids showing victims alive, then unconscious, then dead, then dissected, arranged in careful chronological sequence. The refrigerator contained more body parts, lungs, liver, kidneys, intestines, all wrapped and stored like meat. Jars of formaldehyde held preserved genitals. A filing cabinet contained detailed writings about the murders, fantasies about creating a compliant zombie-like companion. The bathtub showed drill marks and chemical residue. Investigators later learned Dahmer had drilled holes into some victims' skulls while they were unconscious and poured hydrochloric acid into their brains, attempting to create living but brain-damaged sex slaves who wouldn't leave him. None survived these experiments. By dawn, Milwaukee police had identified remains from 11 different victims in Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. The man who answered the door so politely had been killing, butchering, and cannibalizing human beings for over a decade. The question wasn't just what he'd done. The question was how no one had stopped him sooner. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. His early childhood appeared unremarkable to outsiders, but warning signs emerged early. Joyce suffered from severe depression and prescription drug dependency during her pregnancy. Lionel, a chemistry student who would later become a research chemist, was often absent, absorbed in his studies. Jeffrey was a shy, quiet child who seemed to retreat further inward after the birth of his younger brother David in 1966. At age 4, Jeffrey underwent surgery for a double hernia. Family members later reported a noticeable change in his personality afterward. He became more withdrawn, less responsive to affection. By age 6, he had begun collecting dead animals from the roadside, fascinated by their bodies. His father, trying to connect with his strange son, taught him how to bleach and preserve animal bones using chemicals. Jeffrey became obsessed with the process, spending hours in the family tool shed dismembering roadkill, dissolving flesh in acid, articulating skeletons. Lionel thought it was scientific curiosity. It wasn't. By his early teens, Dahmer had progressed from roadkill to fantasizing about human bodies. He later described lying in bed, imagining men unconscious and compliant, available for his use. He was gay, but couldn't accept it. Growing up in the conservative Midwest of the 1970s, where homosexuality was shameful and secret, his sexual awakening became inextricably linked with violence and control. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a possession, something that couldn't reject him, couldn't leave, couldn't have autonomy or will. His parents' marriage disintegrated through his adolescence, filled with screaming arguments and mutual resentment. When they finally divorced in 1978, both parents moved out of the family home. They left Jeffrey alone in the house at age 18, essentially abandoning him. 3 weeks after his high school graduation, alone in that empty house, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. Stephen Hicks, 19, was hitchhiking to a concert when Dahmer picked him up on June 18, 1978. Dahmer invited him back to the house for beer and marijuana. They drank. They talked. When Hicks said he needed to leave, Dahmer didn't want him to go. He picked up a dumbbell and struck Hicks twice in the head, killing him. He then masturbated over the body, experiencing a sexual release more intense than anything he'd felt before. The fantasy had become reality, and reality was better than the fantasy. Dahmer dismembered Hicks's body in the crawlspace, dissolved the flesh in acid, smashed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered the fragments in the woods behind the house. He was meticulous, methodical, driven by a need to completely control and possess another human being. He later described the murder as both horrifying and inevitable, as if he'd been compelled by forces he couldn't resist. But that was a lie, he told himself. He'd planned it. He'd chosen it. He'd created a situation where he could act on his fantasies without interference. For 9 years after killing Stephen Hicks, Dahmer didn't murder again. He joined the Army in 1979, became a medic, drank heavily, and was discharged for alcoholism in 1981. He moved to Florida, moved back to Milwaukee, lived with his grandmother Catherine Dahmer in the suburb of West Allis. He was arrested for indecent exposure in 1982 and again in 1986. His grandmother tolerated his drinking and strange hours, but eventually asked him to leave after finding disturbing items in the basement: a mannequin, strange chemicals, a dark stain on the floor that looked like blood. In September 1987, Dahmer picked up Stephen Tuomi, 25, at a gay bar in Milwaukee. They went to the Ambassador Hotel. Dahmer drugged Tuomi's drink with sleeping pills, then strangled him while he was unconscious. When he woke up the next morning, Tuomi was dead beside him. Dahmer later claimed he didn't remember killing him, that he'd blacked out from alcohol and pills. But he knew what to do next. He bought a large suitcase, dismembered Tuomi's body in the hotel bathroom, packed the pieces in the suitcase, and took a taxi back to his grandmother's house. He disposed of the body parts gradually over several weeks. Something broke open inside Dahmer after Tuomi's murder. The 9-year gap between his first and second killings collapsed. Over the next 4 years, he would murder 15 more people, accelerating rapidly, refining his techniques, developing a systematic process of luring, drugging, killing, and preserving his victims. His victim selection pattern was consistent. Young men, often minorities, often from vulnerable populations, sex workers, homeless individuals, men from the gay community who wouldn't be immediately missed. He frequented gay bars, bus stations, shopping malls, offering money for nude photographs or company. Once he got them to his grandmother's house, and later to his own apartment, he drugged them with sedative-laced drinks. His preferred method was to render victims unconscious with sleeping pills dissolved in alcohol, then strangle them manually or with a ligature. He had sex with the bodies after death, often keeping corpses for days or weeks, sleeping beside them, photographing them in various poses. The necrophilia was central to his pathology. He wanted partners who couldn't leave, couldn't reject him, couldn't judge him. Death made them perfectly compliant, but decomposition destroyed that. So he began experimenting with preservation techniques, freezing heads, dissolving bodies in acid, stripping and bleaching skeletons to keep his trophies. James Dustater, 14, was murdered in January 1988. Richard Guerrero, 25, in March 1988. Anthony Sears, 26, in March 1989. Dahmer kept Sears' skull and genitals, painted the skull gray to make it look like a plastic prop. In May 1990, he moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, a one-bedroom unit that would become his private charnel house. The isolation of his own apartment, away from his grandmother's supervision, allowed him to accelerate. Raymond Smith, 33, was murdered in May 1990. Edward Smith, 28, in June. Ernest Miller, 22, in September. Dahmer kept Miller's skeleton intact, bleached it, and displayed it in his bedroom. David Thomas, 23, in September. Curtis Straughter, 18, in February 1991. Errol Lindsay, 19, in April 1991. On May 27, 1991, Dahmer's pathology intersected with one of the most disturbing failures of police intervention in American history. 14-year-old Conorak Synthesomphone, the younger brother of a boy Dahmer had sexually assaulted in 1988, was lured to the apartment with an offer of money for photographs. Dahmer drugged him, drilled a hole into his skull, and injected hydrochloric acid into his brain. While Dahmer went to buy more beer, Synthesomphone, somehow still alive, confused and injured, escaped the apartment. 3 young black women found him wandering naked and bleeding on the street. They called 911. Milwaukee police officers John Balkerzak and Joseph Gabrish responded. Dahmer arrived and explained that Synthesomphone was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they'd had a lover's quarrel, that he'd had too much to drink. The officers, despite the boy's obvious distress, his inability to communicate, the presence of concerned witnesses insisting something was wrong, accepted Dahmer's explanation. They escorted Synthesomphone back to apartment 213. They entered briefly, saw the photographs Dahmer claimed he'd taken of his boyfriend, smelled the chemical odor, but didn't investigate. They left Conorak Synthesomphone with Jeffrey Dahmer. Within an hour, Dahmer strangled the boy, had sex with his corpse, dismembered him, and kept his skull. The officers radioed dispatch joking about reuniting the lovers, their voices captured on tape, laughing about having to deal with what they assumed was a domestic dispute in the gay community. Those tapes would later become evidence in a civil rights lawsuit. Those officers' failure to investigate, their implicit bias, their complete abdication of duty, cost Conorak Synthesomphone his life and allowed Dahmer to kill 4 more people. If they had looked in the bedroom, they would have found photographs of dead bodies. If they had checked identification, they would have discovered Synthesomphone was a minor. If they had done their jobs, 11 people would still be alive. After Synthesomphone, Dahmer killed Matt Turner, 20, in June 1991. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, in July. Oliver Lacey, 23, in July. Joseph Breithoft, 25, in July. He was killing every few days now, the cooling-off period between murders nearly eliminated. His apartment was filled with body parts, rotting and preserved. Neighbors complained about the smell. The building manager confronted Dahmer, who claimed his freezer had broken and meat had spoiled. Neighbors heard power saws running at night, heard screams and crying. No one called the police, or if they did, no one investigated thoroughly enough. Tracy Edwards was supposed to be victim 18. Dahmer lured him to the apartment on July 22nd, with an offer to drink beer and watch videos. Once inside, Edwards noticed the chemical smell, saw the photographs of dismembered bodies, realized too late what was happening. Dahmer handcuffed one of his wrists and held a knife to his chest, forcing him to the bedroom. For hours, Dahmer made Edwards watch The Exorcist 3 while threatening him, explaining that he was going to take photographs before killing him. Edwards waited for an opportunity. When Dahmer became distracted, Edwards punched him in the face and ran. That punch, that escape, that sprint down North 25th Street saved Tracy Edwards' life and ended Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree. When officers Mueller and Routh opened the refrigerator and freezer, when they found the photographs and the drums of acid and the skulls, the full scope of Dahmer's crimes became undeniable. He was arrested and charged initially with murder. As investigators cataloged the remains, matched them to missing persons reports, interviewed witnesses who'd seen victims with Dahmer before they disappeared, the body count climbed to 17 confirmed victims. Dahmer confessed within hours of his arrest. He waived his right to an attorney initially and described his crimes in calm, detailed language, explaining his process methodically. He showed investigators where he'd disposed of remains, how he'd selected victims, what he'd done with their bodies. He expressed something resembling remorse, but also a strange detachment, as if discussing someone else's actions. He described his desire to create a living zombie through the skull-drilling experiments, his cannibalism of biceps and thighs from some victims, his preservation of skulls and skeletons as mementos. He admitted everything. There was no point denying it. The evidence filled his apartment. The victims were identified slowly, agonizingly, as forensic anthropologists worked to match remains to missing persons. Stephen Hicks, missing since 1978. Stephen Tuomi, 1987. James Doxtator, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears from 1988 to 1989. Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conorak Synthesymphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Breithoft from 1990 to 1991. 15 of the 17 victims were men of color: Black, Hispanic, Asian. Many were gay. Many were from vulnerable populations that society often overlooked. The families of those victims had been searching for answers for months or years. Rita Isbell, sister of Errol Lindsay, delivered a victim impact statement at Dahmer's sentencing that remains one of the most powerful expressions of grief and rage ever recorded in an American courtroom. She screamed at Dahmer, lunged toward him, had to be restrained by deputies. "You took my 19-year-old brother away from me," she shouted. "I never want to see my mother go through that again. I hate you." Catherine Lacey, mother of Oliver Lacey, described waiting for her son to come home, not knowing he'd been murdered and dismembered, his head stored in Dahmer's freezer. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. His defense team entered a plea of guilty but insane, arguing that no sane person could commit such acts. The prosecution argued that Dahmer was entirely sane by legal standards. He knew right from wrong, he planned his crimes carefully, he took extensive steps to avoid detection. The jury heard psychiatric testimony from both sides. Dr. Frederick Fosdahl testified for the defense that Dahmer suffered from necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and alcohol dependence. Dr. Park Dietz testified for the prosecution that Dahmer had paraphilias, but was legally sane, capable of controlling his behavior, and chose not to. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. They found Jeffrey Dahmer sane and guilty of 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853, so Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison. Dahmer was also convicted in the 1978 murder of Stephen Hicks and received a 16th life sentence. He was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He initially requested solitary confinement, fearing other inmates would kill him. Prison officials denied the request and placed him in general population. In prison, Dahmer became a born-again Christian, was baptized, and claimed to have found redemption through faith. He gave interviews to news programs and FBI profilers, attempting to explain his psychology, his compulsions, his belief that he was irredeemably evil. He expressed remorse, but also a kind of intellectual curiosity about his own pathology, as if he were studying himself as a specimen. He corresponded with his father Lionel, who wrote a memoir titled A Father's Story, attempting to understand how his son became a serial killer. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail cleaning the prison gymnasium bathroom with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Anderson was serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. Scarver was serving a life sentence for murder and had a history of psychotic episodes. Correctional officers left the 3 men unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes. When officers returned, Dahmer and Anderson were on the floor, their skulls crushed by blows from a 20-pound metal bar Scarver had taken from the gym equipment. Dahmer died from severe head trauma en route to the hospital. He was 34 years old. Scarver later told reporters that he'd killed Dahmer because he was repulsed by his crimes, and because Dahmer had taunted other inmates by shaping his prison food to resemble severed limbs and drizzling ketchup on them as fake blood. Scarver claimed that God had told him to kill Dahmer, that he was an instrument of divine justice. Prison officials were criticized for leaving 3 violent offenders unsupervised, particularly when they knew Dahmer was a target. Some victim family members expressed relief at his death. Others felt cheated of the justice of watching him serve his full sentence. The Dahmer case exposed catastrophic failures at multiple levels of the criminal justice system. He had been convicted of sexually assaulting Conorak Synthesum Phone's older brother in 1988 and served only 10 months of a 1-year sentence. His probation officer's reports noted his isolation and strange behavior, but recommended early release. When police returned Conorak Synthesum Phone to Dahmer's apartment in 1991, they failed to check for warrants, failed to investigate, failed to protect a child. Those officers, Balcherzak and Gabrish, were initially fired, but later reinstated by the police union. Balcherzak eventually became president of the Milwaukee Police Association. The case also highlighted society's willingness to overlook violence against marginalized populations. Dahmer's victims were predominantly young men of color from the gay community. Their disappearances didn't trigger the same level of media attention or police resources that missing white women receive. When neighbors reported screams and chemical smells, their complaints were dismissed. When a naked, bleeding teenager was found on the street, police sided with the white man who claimed ownership over him. Systemic racism, homophobia, and institutional indifference created an environment where Jeffrey Dahmer could kill 17 people over 13 years. Forensic psychologists have studied Dahmer extensively, trying to understand the intersection of his various paraphilias and compulsions. His necrophilia was profound. He was sexually aroused primarily by dead bodies, not living partners. His need for control stemmed from deep abandonment issues and an inability to form genuine emotional connections. His cannibalism, which he described as a way to make victims part of him permanently, reflected an infantile fantasy of total possession. His skull-drilling experiments attempting to create zombie sex slaves demonstrated both his complete objectification of other humans and his desperate loneliness. He wanted companions who couldn't leave. But psychological explanation is not exoneration. Dahmer made choices. He chose to drug men instead of seeking consensual partners. He chose to kill instead of allowing people to leave. He chose to dismember, preserve, and consume human beings to satisfy his compulsions. Many people experience trauma, abandonment, and psychological disorders without becoming serial killers. Dahmer's pathology was extreme, but his actions were deliberate. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He did it anyway because his gratification mattered more to him than other people's lives. The impact of his crimes extends far beyond his 17 victims. Families were destroyed. The Synthosamphone family lost a son and brother because police officers didn't do their jobs. The city of Milwaukee's reputation was permanently stained. The gay community faced renewed stigma and discrimination. Parents of young men felt paralyzing fear. The Oxford Apartments building was eventually demolished because no one would live there. The site is now a vacant lot. The city of Milwaukee refused to allow any memorial to be erected, fearing it would become a dark tourism attraction. The evidence from Dahmer's apartment, the photographs, the tools, the refrigerator, was eventually destroyed. The skulls and remains were cremated and given to victims' families for burial. Dahmer's brain was preserved briefly for scientific study, but his mother Joyce objected, and it was eventually cremated with the rest of his remains. His ashes were divided between his parents. Lionel Dahmer kept his son's ashes for years before eventually scattering them in an undisclosed location. Jeffrey Dahmer's freezer, filled with severed heads and human hearts, has become a symbol of evil in American popular culture. True crime documentaries, films, and television series have retold his story repeatedly, often focusing on the lurid details of his crimes rather than the humanity of his victims. But the freezer is not the story. The freezer is just a refrigerator that contained evidence of 17 murders. The story is Stephen Hicks, who wanted to go to a concert. The story is Conorak Synthosamphone, who should have been saved by police. The story is Ernest Miller, whose skeleton Dahmer kept as a trophy. The story is Tracy Edwards, who fought back and survived. The 7 skulls, 4 severed heads, and heart in a box that police found in apartment 213 were not trophies of a criminal mastermind. They were the remains of human beings whose lives mattered, who had families and friends and futures, who were destroyed by a man who valued his sexual gratification more than their right to exist. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a genius or a monster. He was a deeply damaged man who made monstrous choices repeatedly and would have continued making them if Tracy Edwards hadn't escaped, if officers Roth and Mueller hadn't investigated, if that freezer door had never been opened. Evil exists. It exists in the gap between knowing something is wrong and choosing to do it anyway. It exists in the willingness to treat other human beings as objects for personal use. It exists in 17 families who will never see their sons again, in a mother's scream in a courtroom, in a brother's skeleton displayed like decoration. Jeffrey Dahmer's freezer is not a fascination. It's a graveyard. And the people who died, so he could fill, it deserved to be remembered as more than his victims, as individuals, as losses, as warnings about what happens when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Claude Swain puede cometer errores. Por favor, verifica las respuestas.